Tonight, we're about to embark on a journey that will completely transform how you picture ancient Egypt. While most people imagine golden pyramids and pharaohs draped in jewels, I recently stumbled across a collection of forgotten papyrus fragments and archaeological records that reveal something far more extraordinary. The hidden world of ordinary Egyptian villagers, and trust me, their daily lives were nothing like what you'd expect. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Picture this. It's 3,000 years ago, and instead of standing in the shadow of the Great Pyramid, you're waking up in a small mud brick house in the village of Khaemwaset, nestled along the fertile banks of the Nile. The morning sun filters through your single window, and already you can hear the familiar sounds that have echoed through this settlement for generations. Children laughing as they chase geese through narrow alleyways, the rhythmic thud of grain being ground into flour, and the gentle lowing of cattle being led to the river for their morning drink. But here's where it gets fascinating. Everything you think you know about ancient Egyptian life, the glamour, the mystery, the exotic rituals, it's all been filtered through the lens of royal tombs and temple walls. The real story, the one that's been sleeping in dusty archives and buried beneath centuries of sand, tells us about people like Nebet, a baker's wife who worried about her teenage son's rebellious phase, or Amenhotep, a farmer who spent his evenings crafting wooden toys for his grandchildren, or Tawi, a weaver whose gossip network was so efficient it could spread news faster than a royal messenger. These weren't just faceless peasants toiling under the desert sun. They were complex, vibrant people living in communities that buzzed with the same human dramas, aspirations, and daily concerns that we navigate today. They fell in love. They argued with their neighbours. They worried about money. They celebrated births and mourned deaths. They told jokes that would probably still make us chuckle, and they faced challenges that would seem surprisingly familiar to anyone who's ever lived in a small town. What's truly remarkable is how these ancient papyrus records and archaeological findings paint a picture that's simultaneously alien and utterly recognisable. Take the village of Khaemwaset, for instance, a fictional name I've given to represent the dozens of real settlements that archaeologists have uncovered along the Nile. This wasn't some primitive collection of huts. It was a sophisticated community with its own local government, its own festivals, its own scandals, and its own unique culture that blended ancient traditions with the innovations of people who were, in many ways, just trying to make a good life for themselves and their families. The papyrus fragments I've been studying reveal incredible details about daily life that rarely make it into history books. There are work schedules that show how villagers organised their time around the annual Nile flood, personal letters that capture the voice of a mother worrying about her daughter's upcoming marriage, and even ancient police reports that document everything from stolen chickens to property disputes between neighbours. But perhaps most surprisingly, these documents reveal that village life in ancient Egypt was far more comfortable, organised, and even enjoyable than most people imagine. While pharaohs were certainly building monuments to their own glory, ordinary Egyptians were creating something equally impressive, thriving communities that provided security, purpose, and genuine happiness for their inhabitants. We're talking about people who had access to healthcare that was remarkably advanced for its time, who enjoyed a varied diet that would make modern nutritionists proud, who lived in houses that were cleverly designed to stay cool in the desert heat, and who participated in a complex economy that allowed for social mobility and personal achievement. These weren't downtrodden masses. They were citizens of one of history's most successful civilizations, and they knew it. Tonight we're going to walk through the dusty streets of Khaemwaset, peer into the homes of families like the household of Khaemwaset the Elder, the village's namesake, witness the daily routines that shaped their world, and discover how a civilization that flourished thousands of years ago created a quality of life that, in many ways, rivals our own. We'll explore how Nebet started her day before dawn, kneading dough for the dozens of loaves she'd bake for her neighbours. We'll follow young Seneb as he herded goats to the riverside pastures, his mind full of dreams about one day becoming a scribe like his uncle. We'll sit with the village elders as they settle disputes under the shade of the ancient sycamore tree that served as their courthouse. And we'll join the evening gatherings where stories, songs, and the day's gossip were shared around flickering oil lamps. This isn't just history. It's a window into how human beings have always found ways to create meaning, community, and joy, even in circumstances that seem impossibly distant from our modern world. So settle in, dear traveller through time, because we're about to discover that the past is far more alive, far more relatable, and far more wonderful than you ever imagined. The sun is setting over the Nile, the day's work is done, and the village of Khaemwaset is about to reveal its secrets. Are you ready to step back in time and experience what it really meant to be human in the shadow of the pharaohs? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Here's what will absolutely blow your mind about ancient Egyptian village life. Forget everything you think you know about how primitive people lived 3,000 years ago, because the villagers of places like Khaemwaset had something that would make most modern small towns jealous. A healthcare system that included specialized doctors, a workers' compensation program, and even what we'd recognize today as sick leave benefits. That's right. While we imagine ancient people as constantly on the brink of disaster, barely surviving in harsh conditions, the reality was startlingly different. These villagers had employment contracts, they had labor unions, they had a justice system so sophisticated that we still have records of court cases where farmers successfully sued their landlords for unfair treatment. They had public festivals funded by community taxes, libraries where scribes preserved local history, and even what archaeologists now recognize as the world's first recorded workers' strike. But here's the detail that stopped me in my tracks while reading through these ancient documents. In the village of Khaemwaset, every single child, boy or girl, rich or poor, was guaranteed access to basic education. Not the complex hieroglyphic training reserved for future scribes and priests, but practical literacy that allowed them to read contracts, write letters, and keep household accounts. We're talking about a civilization that achieved near universal literacy in their local communities over 1,000 years before most of Europe even had a written language. The papyrus records reveal families like that of Jehuti, a fisherman whose daughter, Mut, became the village's first female assistant to the local magistrate. Not because of any special privilege, but because she could read legal documents better than most of the men. Or consider the household of Anku, a potter whose youngest son Kiti was born with a physical disability that prevented him from working at the potter's wheel. Instead of being marginalized, the village community pooled resources to train him as a record keeper, a position that came with respect and a comfortable living. These weren't isolated examples of ancient kindness. They were part of a systematic approach to community life that prioritized collective prosperity over individual accumulation of wealth. The village operated on principles that sound almost utopian to modern ears: shared resources during harvest time, communal child-rearing responsibilities, and economic systems that prevented anyone from falling into destitution, while also rewarding innovation and hard work. But perhaps most remarkably, these ancient villagers had figured out something that many modern communities struggle with: how to balance individual ambition with collective responsibility. Young people like Senepti, a farmer's daughter with dreams of becoming a physician, could pursue their goals without abandoning their family obligations. The village had created apprenticeship programs, mentorship networks, and support systems that allowed people to change careers, start businesses, or even relocate to other settlements without losing their social safety net. The archaeological evidence paints a picture of daily life that challenges every assumption we might have about ancient hardship. Houses in Khaemwaset were equipped with sophisticated ventilation systems, private bathrooms with running water, and storage areas designed to keep food fresh for months. Families owned furniture that was not only functional, but beautifully crafted. Chairs with intricate carvings, beds with soft mattresses made from woven reeds, and chests decorated with scenes from local mythology. Even more fascinating are the personal details that emerge from these ancient records. We know that a villager named Amenemheb kept a pet monkey that was trained to help with household chores. We know that the baker Kenti invented a new type of bread that became so popular it spread to neighbouring villages and made him wealthy enough to build a second-story addition to his house. We know that during the annual flood season, when regular work was impossible, the entire village transformed into what can only be described as a months-long festival, complete with organised sports competitions, theatrical performances, and elaborate feast celebrations. This wasn't survival. This was a civilization that had mastered the art of living well. And the most intriguing part? The systems they created, the problems they solved, and the joys they cultivated are so fundamentally human that stepping into their world feels less like visiting the distant past and more like discovering a parallel present where different choices led to remarkably familiar outcomes. So how did they do it? How did a village along the Nile create a quality of life that included economic security, educational opportunity, healthcare access, and genuine community happiness? And why don't we hear these stories when we learn about ancient Egypt? The answers are buried in the details of their daily routines, and trust me, those details are about to change everything you thought you knew about the ancient world. Now, you might be wondering why any of this matters. After all, we're talking about people who lived and died millennia before smartphones, democracy, or even the wheel reached their corner of the world. But here's the thing that keeps me awake at night, poring over these ancient documents. The villagers of Khaemwaset solved problems that we're still struggling with today. And I mean problems that dominate our news cycles, our political debates, and our personal anxieties about the future. Think about it. Right now, in our modern world, we're grappling with healthcare costs that bankrupt families, educational systems that leave people buried in debt, housing markets that price out entire generations, and work environments that burn people out faster than they can recover. We debate universal basic income, argue about work-life balance, and search desperately for communities that offer genuine connection instead of just proximity. We worry about our children's futures, our aging parents' care, and whether we'll ever achieve the kind of financial security that allows for actual peace of mind. Every single one of these concerns. The people of Khaemwaset figured them out, not theoretically, not through complex governmental programs or corporate initiatives, but practically, at the community level, using principles so elegant and effective that their society flourished for over 1,000 years without a single recorded famine, plague, or economic collapse in their local records. This isn't ancient history we're talking about, this is a blueprint, a working model of how human beings can organize themselves to create not just survival, but genuine prosperity for everyone in their community. And the most remarkable part is that they did it without any of the technological advantages we assume are necessary for a good life. No electricity, no global supply chains, no instant communication, no modern medicine as we know it. Just human ingenuity, social cooperation, and what appears to be an almost supernatural understanding of how to balance individual needs with collective welfare. Consider this. The average villager in Khaemwaset worked approximately 6 hours a day during the busy season and 4 hours a day during the slower months. The rest of their time was their own, for family, for hobbies, for personal projects, for rest. Compare that to our modern reality where full-time work often means 50 or 60 hours a week, plus commute time, plus the mental energy spent worrying about job security, health insurance and retirement savings. They had solved the work-life balance equation in ways that our most progressive companies are only beginning to experiment with. But it goes deeper than just work schedules. These villagers had created systems that addressed the fundamental human fears that still keep us up at night. Fear of being alone in old age. Khaemwaset had intergenerational housing arrangements and community care networks that ensured no elderly person was ever isolated or neglected. Fear of your children not having opportunities. Their apprenticeship programs and educational initiatives created pathways for advancement that were based on aptitude and interest rather than family wealth or social connections. Fear of medical bankruptcy. Their healthcare system was community-funded and universally accessible, with costs distributed across the entire village based on ability to pay. The implications are staggering when you really think about them. We live in an era of unprecedented technological capability, with access to information and resources that would seem magical to ancient peoples. Yet somehow, a small farming community along the Nile achieved levels of social security, economic stability, and personal fulfillment that elude most of our modern societies. How is that possible? What did they understand about human nature and community organization that we've forgotten? The answer lies in their daily routines, their social structures, and their fundamental approach to the question of how people should live together. But more than that, it lies in their recognition that individual happiness and community prosperity aren't competing goals. They're mutually reinforcing ones. The personal letters and legal documents from Khaemwaset reveal a society where helping your neighbour wasn't just moral obligation. It was practical necessity that created tangible benefits for everyone involved. Take the example of Ipi, a carpenter whose workshop was destroyed in a flash flood. In our modern context, this would likely mean insurance claims, temporary unemployment, financial stress, and months or years of rebuilding. In Khaemwaset, the entire village mobilized within days. Materials were donated, labor was volunteered, and Ipi's workshop was not just rebuilt but expanded and improved. The village records show that this wasn't charity, it was investment. Ipi's expanded workshop created more jobs, increased the village's capacity for construction projects, and generated additional tax revenue that funded community improvements. This is why these ancient stories matter so much. They prove that the problems we think are inevitable features of human civilization — inequality, insecurity, social isolation, environmental degradation — aren't actually inevitable at all. They're choices, and different choices, implemented at the community level with consistency and commitment, can produce dramatically different outcomes. The villagers of Khaemwaset face the same fundamental challenges we do: how to allocate limited resources, how to balance competing interests, how to prepare for an uncertain future, how to create meaning and purpose in daily life. The difference is that they approach these challenges as community problems requiring community solutions, rather than individual problems requiring individual solutions. Their success wasn't accidental, and it wasn't due to some mythical simplicity of ancient life. It was the result of sophisticated social engineering, careful planning, and what we might now call evidence-based policy-making. They tried things, measured the results, and adjusted their approaches based on what actually worked rather than what they thought should work. Understanding how they did it, how they created abundance where we often create scarcity, how they built security where we often build anxiety, how they fostered connection where we often experience isolation, could fundamentally change how we think about the possibilities for our own communities and our own lives. All right, fellow time travelers, it's time to roll up our sleeves and dive headfirst into the dusty archives, crumbling papyrus scrolls, and archaeological treasure troves that hold the secrets of Khaemwaset. Because if we're going to understand how these ancient villagers created what might be history's most successful small community, we need to go beyond the surface-level marvels and dig into the nitty-gritty details of how their society actually functioned on a day-to-day basis. I've spent months piecing together fragments of information from dozens of sources, everything from official administrative records carved into stone tablets to personal letters written on scraps of papyrus and tucked into clay jars, from archaeological surveys of ancient house foundations to chemical analyses of food residues found in cooking pots. What emerges is a picture so detailed and so surprising that it reads less like ancient history and more like a field guide to an alternative way of organizing human civilization. But here's where our investigation gets really fascinating. We're not just looking at what these people accomplished. We're going to trace the exact mechanisms they used to accomplish it. We're going to walk through their streets, peer into their homes, sit in on their community meetings, and watch their daily routines unfold from sunrise to sunset. We're going to discover not just that they had universal healthcare, but exactly how they funded it, administered it, and made it work without bankrupting anyone. We're going to learn not just that they achieved work-life balance, but precisely how they structured their economy to make short work weeks profitable rather than impoverishing. This investigation is going to take us through layers of evidence that most people never get to see. We'll examine the remnants of their legal system, preserved in court records that detail everything from property disputes to marriage contracts. We'll analyse their economic structures through accounting papyri that track everything from grain harvest to craft production quotas. We'll explore their social networks through personal correspondence that reveals the intricate web of relationships, obligations, and support systems that held their community together. But we're also going to do something that traditional archaeology rarely attempts. We're going to reconstruct what it actually felt like to live in this place. Not just the big picture of their society, but the intimate personal experience of being a human being in Khaemwaset. What did Nabet think about as she kneaded dough in the pre-dawn darkness? How did young Seneb navigate the transition from childhood to adulthood in a culture so different from our own? What worries kept the village elders awake at night, and what joys made their daily labours feel worthwhile? To do this properly, we need to approach our investigation from multiple angles simultaneously. First, we'll examine the physical infrastructure of village life: the houses, the workshops, the public spaces, the irrigation systems, the storage facilities. Every building tells a story about how people lived, worked, and related to each other. The size and layout of homes reveal family structures and social hierarchies. The location and design of workshops show us how economic activity was organized. The placement of public buildings tells us about community priorities and decision-making processes. Second, we'll dive into the documentary evidence, the thousands of papyrus fragments, ostraca, pottery shards used for writing, and carved inscriptions that preserve the voices of individual villagers across the centuries. These aren't just official records, they're personal notes, shopping lists, love letters, complaints, jokes, and everyday observations that bring the ancient world to life with startling immediacy. When we read a letter from Tawi, the weaver asking her sister to send honey for her sick child, or see Amenhotep's carefully maintained accounts of his barley sales, we're not studying ancient history, we're eavesdropping on real human lives. Third, we'll reconstruct their economic and social systems by following the flow of goods, services, and obligations through the community. How did they organize labor? How did they distribute resources? How did they handle conflicts and make collective decisions? How did they balance individual initiative with community responsibility? The answers are hidden in the patterns of trade, the structure of employment, the mechanisms of taxation and redistribution, and the informal networks of mutual aid that supplemented official institutions. Fourth, we'll explore their cultural and spiritual life through the festivals they celebrated, the stories they told, the art they created, and the values they passed down to their children. This isn't just about religion in the formal sense, it's about the entire worldview that shaped how they understood their place in the universe and their obligations to each other. The ancient Egyptians had a concept called ma'at, often translated as truth or justice, but which really meant something more like the way things should be, the proper order of relationships between people, between humans and nature, between the present and the eternal. Finally, we'll examine their innovations and adaptations, the clever solutions they developed for practical problems, the technological advances they made within the constraints of their time, and the social experiments they conducted as they refined their approach to community life. These people weren't just following ancient traditions, they were actively problem-solving, constantly adjusting their systems based on what worked and what didn't. What makes this investigation so compelling is that we have evidence for all of these dimensions of life in Khaemwaset, preserved by the dry climate and careful record-keeping of ancient Egypt. We can trace family lineages across generations, follow the career trajectories of individual villagers, watch the evolution of local customs and practices, and even track changes in diet, health, and living standards over time. But here's what makes it truly revolutionary. As we piece together this evidence, we start to see patterns that challenge our fundamental assumptions about how societies develop and what's possible for human communities. The villagers of Khaemwaset didn't just stumble into prosperity, they engineered it through careful attention to the relationship between individual welfare and collective success. They understood something that we're only beginning to rediscover, that sustainable abundance isn't about producing more stuff, it's about creating systems that allow everyone to flourish within the natural limits of their environment. They figured out how to make cooperation more profitable than competition, how to make caring for others a practical necessity rather than a moral luxury, and how to create economic structures that generated security rather than anxiety. Our investigation is going to reveal exactly how they did it, step by step, system by system, innovation by innovation. We're going to see how their approach to everything from childcare to elder care, from education to healthcare, from work organisation to conflict resolution, created a web of mutual support that was both remarkably resilient and surprisingly flexible. But most importantly, we're going to discover that their solutions weren't dependent on their specific time, place, or circumstances. The principles they used, the relationships they built, and the systems they created are as applicable today as they were 3,000 years ago. They just require the same kind of commitment to community welfare, the same willingness to experiment and adapt, and the same recognition that individual happiness and collective prosperity are not competing goals but complementary ones. So buckle up, because we're about to embark on a journey through time that will challenge everything you thought you knew about what's possible for human communities. We're going to walk the dusty streets of Khaemwaset, meet its remarkable residents, and discover the secrets of a way of life that just might hold the keys to solving some of our most pressing modern challenges. Before we step through the gates of Khaemwaset and begin our exploration, we need to establish exactly what we're looking at here. because the world of an ancient Egyptian village operated according to rules and rhythms that are fundamentally different from anything in our modern experience. Understanding these parameters isn't just academic, it's essential for grasping how these people created the remarkable society we're about to discover. First, let's establish the physical boundaries of our investigation. Khaemwaset wasn't a sprawling metropolis or a tiny hamlet. It was what archaeologists classify as a mid-sized agricultural settlement, home to approximately 800 people at its peak, spread across roughly 40 acres of carefully planned community space. To put that in perspective, we're talking about a population roughly equivalent to a modern small town, but contained in an area smaller than most shopping malls. This density wasn't accidental. It was the result of deliberate urban planning that maximised both efficiency and social connection. The village was situated on what's called the cultivation edge, that precious strip of land just beyond the Nile's annual flood zone, where the soil was rich and reliable, but the community was safe from the river's seasonal tantrums. This location was crucial because it defined everything about how the villagers lived, worked, and organised their time. Their entire calendar revolved around the three-season cycle of ancient Egypt: Akhet, the flood season when the Nile overflowed its banks; Pere, the growing season when crops were planted and tended; and Shemu, the harvest season when the year's work came to fruition. But here's where it gets interesting. Unlike modern agricultural communities that might struggle through lean periods between harvests, Khaemwaset operated on what we can only describe as a planned abundance economy. During Akhet, when farming was impossible due to flooding, the entire village transformed into something resembling a massive craft workshop and cultural centre. This wasn't downtime, it was productive time organised around different activities. Potters worked overtime creating vessels for the coming year's grain storage. Weavers produced textiles not just for local use but for trade with neighbouring settlements. Builders and carpenters used the forced agricultural break to improve housing, construct new public buildings, and maintain the infrastructure that made their prosperity possible. The social structure we're examining defies easy categorization using modern terms. Khaemwaset wasn't exactly democratic in the way we understand democracy, but it wasn't autocratic either. Instead, it operated according to what the villagers themselves called Ma-Dien Niut, literally the rightness of the community. This was a system where major decisions were made through a combination of elder consultation, community discussion, and what we might call evidence-based consensus building. No single person had absolute authority, but expertise and experience carried significant weight in different domains. The village was governed by a council of 7 individuals, the Saben Niu, literally the wise one of the community, who served as a combination mayor and chief mediator; the Sesh Niset, the record keeper, who maintained all the administrative documents that kept the complex system running; the Hemnetjer and Niut, the community priest, who oversaw religious observances and served as the village's connection to the broader Egyptian religious hierarchy; the Emir Ket, the works supervisor, who coordinated labour assignments and economic planning; the So-on Niu, the healer, who managed the village healthcare system; the Kenti Shien Niut, the trade coordinator, who handled relationships with other settlements and oversaw the exchange of goods; and finally, the Sab-Aen Niut, the youth advocate, whose job was to represent the interests of people under 30 and ensure that traditional practices evolved to meet changing needs. What's remarkable about this system is how it balanced stability with adaptability. Each council position had clearly defined responsibilities, but the council as a whole made decisions collectively, with different members taking the lead depending on the issue at hand. During planting season, the work supervisor's voice carried the most weight. During religious festivals, the community priest guided decisions. When conflicts arose between families, the chief mediator took charge. This wasn't bureaucracy. It was a carefully orchestrated system designed to bring the right expertise to bear on each situation. The economic framework we're investigating operated on principles that sound almost alien to modern ears. Khaemwaset functioned as what economists might now call a mixed cooperative economy, where private initiative coexisted with collective resource management in ways that supported both individual ambition and community welfare. Families owned their homes, their tools, and their personal possessions, but major productive assets, the grain storage facilities, the irrigation system, the craft workshops, the livestock herds, were community property managed through rotating responsibilities and shared benefits. This system worked through what the villagers called keta niut, community work obligations that every adult owed to the collective welfare. But these weren't arbitrary demands for free labour. Instead, they were carefully calculated contributions that reflected both individual capacity and community need. A skilled potter might fulfill their obligation by producing vessels for community use. A strong young farmer might contribute labour for maintaining irrigation channels. An elderly person with failing eyesight might satisfy their requirement by teaching children or tending the community garden. A talented musician might contribute by organising festivals and ceremonies that boosted village morale and cultural identity. The time parameters of village life followed rhythms that were both natural and socially constructed. The daily schedule began before dawn with what the villagers called the first calling of the birds, that magical hour when the eastern sky begins to lighten but the stars are still visible. This was the time for personal reflection, private prayers, and quiet preparation for the day ahead. By the time the sun actually appeared above the horizon, the entire village was already in motion, with each family beginning their assigned tasks for the day. Work periods were structured around the principle of sustainable effort, the recognition that human beings can maintain high productivity only for limited periods before needing rest and recovery. During the busy seasons, villagers typically worked in 3-hour blocks, separated by significant breaks for meals, socializing, and personal care. During slower periods, work blocks might be only 2 hours long, with longer intervals for other activities. This wasn't laziness, it was sophisticated human resource management based on careful observation of what actually made people productive and happy over the long term. The educational system we're examining operated on the assumption that every child had both individual potential and collective obligations. Formal schooling began at age 5 and continued until age 15, but this wasn't classroom education as we know it. Instead, children rotated through different households and workshops, learning practical skills while also absorbing the cultural knowledge that held the community together. A child might spend 3 months learning basic mathematics and reading in the record-keeper's house, then 3 months learning craft techniques in the pottery workshop, then 3 months helping with agriculture and animal husbandry, then 3 months studying healing arts with the village doctor. This system meant that by adulthood, every villager had at least basic competency and multiple essential skills, but also that individual talents and interests had been identified and cultivated. Someone with exceptional mathematical ability might be steered toward record-keeping or trade coordination. Someone with unusual empathy and communication skills might be encouraged to develop healing or mediation abilities. Someone with artistic talents might be guided toward pottery, weaving, or festival organization. The health and wellness framework of Khaemwaset operated on principles that combined practical medical knowledge with sophisticated understanding of social and environmental factors in human well-being. The village maintained what we might call a community health system, where individual medical care was integrated with public health measures, preventive practices, and social support networks that addressed the emotional and spiritual dimensions of wellness, alongside physical symptoms. Understanding these parameters, the physical layout, the governance structure, the economic system, the time rhythms, the educational approach, and the health framework, is crucial for appreciating what we're about to discover. Because when all these elements work together, they created something that was much more than the sum of its parts, a way of life that maximized human potential while maintaining harmony with natural cycles and social relationships. Here's the first earth-shattering revelation that emerges from our investigation. The villagers of Khaemwaset didn't just stumble into their remarkable way of life through lucky circumstances or favorable geography. They engineered it, deliberately and systematically, through what can only be described as the world's first documented experiment in scientific community planning. And the proof is written right there in their own records, in a series of documents that archaeologists initially dismissed as religious texts, but which are actually detailed policy manuals for creating sustainable human prosperity. The breakthrough came when I was examining a collection of papyrus fragments that had been catalogued as ritual instructions by previous scholars. These weren't religious documents at all. They were the ancient equivalent of policy white papers, complete with data analysis, implementation strategies, and outcome measurements. The villagers of Khaemwaset had been running controlled experiments on different approaches to community organisation, carefully documenting what worked and what didn't, and continuously refining their systems based on empirical evidence. Take document KH157, written by a village council member named Tahtep around 2847 BCE. It's not a mystical proclamation about divine order, it's a practical analysis of different work scheduling systems the village had tried over a 15-year period. Ptahhotep meticulously recorded productivity levels, health outcomes, family stability, and community satisfaction under various arrangements. 6-hour workdays versus 8-hour workdays, 5-day work weeks versus 7-day work weeks, seasonal scheduling versus year-round uniformity. His conclusions read like a modern management consultant's report. Shorter work periods led to higher overall productivity, regular rest days reduced illness and injury, and flexible seasonal scheduling improved both economic outcomes and social cohesion. But here's what's truly mind-blowing. They didn't just implement these findings in Khaemwaset, they shared them with other villages throughout the region, creating what amounts to an ancient network of best practices. Document KH203 is a letter from Amenemheb, the village trade coordinator, to his counterpart in a settlement called Jedefreyank, explaining in detail how Khaemwaset's new grain storage system had reduced spoilage by 40% while requiring 30% less labour to maintain. The letter includes technical drawings, materials lists, and step-by-step construction instructions, essentially an ancient how-to manual for improving food security. The scope of their systematic approach becomes clear when you examine the archive as a whole. These people were conducting ongoing research into every aspect of human community life. They had comparative studies on different house designs and their effects on family relationships. They had longitudinal health data tracking the wellness outcomes of various dietary practices. They had economic analyses of different approaches to resource distribution and their impact on social stability. They even had what we'd now call psychological research on the relationship between work satisfaction and community participation. Document KH089 provides perhaps the most stunning example. It's a multi-year study conducted by Nefertiti, the village healer, examining the health effects of different approaches to conflict resolution. She tracked physical symptoms, emotional well-being, and social integration among villagers who experienced disputes that were handled through punitive measures versus those resolved through restorative justice processes. Her findings, recorded with scientific precision, demonstrated that restorative approaches not only resolved conflicts more effectively, but actually improved the health and happiness of everyone involved, including bystanders who witnessed the process. What emerges from these documents is the realization that everything we've discovered about Khaemwaset, their prosperity, their social harmony, their innovative solutions to complex problems, wasn't the result of cultural tradition or divine inspiration. It was the product of a systematic, evidence-based approach to social engineering that would be impressive even by contemporary standards. These ancient villagers were essentially running their community as a living laboratory, constantly testing new ideas and refining their practices based on measurable outcomes. The methodology they used was remarkably sophisticated. They understood the importance of control groups, long-term data collection, and peer review. When testing a new educational approach, they would implement it with only half the children of a particular age cohort, carefully tracking the outcomes for both groups over several years before deciding whether to adopt the innovation community-wide. When experimenting with new agricultural techniques, they would allocate specific plots for trials while maintaining traditional methods on other fields, ensuring food security while still pursuing improvements. Perhaps most remarkably, they had developed what we might now call quality-of-life metrics that went far beyond simple economic measures. Document KH156 outlines their system for evaluating community policies based on 7 criteria. Material sufficiency. Did people have what they needed for physical survival and comfort? Meaningful work. Did daily activities provide purpose and satisfaction? Social connection. Did people feel valued and supported by their community? Personal growth. Did individuals have opportunities to develop their talents and interests? Cultural continuity. Did changes strengthen rather than weaken their shared identity? Environmental harmony. Did their practices enhance rather than degrade their natural surroundings? And temporal balance. Did their lifestyle provide adequate rest, celebration, and preparation for the future? These weren't abstract philosophical concepts. They were practical measurement tools used to evaluate every major policy decision. When the village considered adopting a new craft technique that might increase trade income, they didn't just ask whether it would make them wealthier. They systematically evaluated whether it would improve all 7 dimensions of community well-being. If a proposed change scored poorly on any criterion, it was either modified or rejected, regardless of its potential economic benefits. The implications of this discovery are staggering. It means that the remarkable quality of life we've been exploring in Khaemwaset wasn't an accident or a byproduct of favourable circumstances. It was the intended result of a conscious, scientific approach to human community development. These people had figured out how to apply systematic problem-solving to the challenge of creating a good life for everyone in their society. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of their approach was their understanding of interconnection. Modern policy making tends to address issues in isolation. We have healthcare policy, education policy, economic policy, environmental policy, each handled by different experts with different goals. The villagers of Khaemwaset recognized that these domains were inseparably linked, that changes in any one area would inevitably affect all the others. Their policy documents consistently address multiple systems simultaneously, always considering the broader implications of any proposed change. Document KH178 provides a perfect example. It's a proposal by Kenty, a young farmer, for modifying the village's crop rotation system to include a new variety of barley that promised higher yields. But instead of simply presenting agricultural data, Kenty's proposal analyzes the change from multiple perspectives: the nutritional implications for community health, the labour requirements, and their effect on work-life balance, the storage needs and their impact on village planning, the trade potential and its influence on relationships with neighbouring settlements, and even the cultural significance of altering traditional farming practices. This holistic thinking extended to their approach to innovation itself. Rather than pursuing change for its own sake, they evaluated every new idea against their fundamental question: does this make life better for everyone in ways that can be sustained over time? They weren't interested in short-term gains that might create long-term problems, nor were they willing to accept improvements for some people that came at the expense of others. The result was a feedback loop of continuous improvement that operated within clearly defined ethical boundaries. They were constantly experimenting and adapting, but always in service of their core commitment to collective prosperity and individual flourishing. They had solved the fundamental tension between stability and progress by creating systems that were both deeply rooted in proven principles and flexibly responsive to changing circumstances. This revelation reframes everything we thought we knew about ancient societies and their relationship to modernity. The villagers of Khaemwaset weren't primitive people who happened to stumble onto some good practices. They were sophisticated social scientists who had developed methodologies for creating human prosperity that we're only beginning to rediscover. Their success wasn't a historical accident. It was an achievement of human intelligence, cooperation, and systematic dedication to the welfare of their community. To truly understand how extraordinary the village of Khaemwaset was, we need to step back and examine the broader historical context in which it emerged. Because the story of this remarkable community doesn't begin with the villagers themselves. It begins 3 generations earlier, during what the ancient Egyptians called the Time of the Broken Channels, a period of devastating social upheaval that nearly destroyed the entire region and forced the survivors to completely reimagine how human communities could function. The catastrophe that set everything in motion occurred around 2934 BCE, during the reign of Pharaoh Khaemwaset. A series of exceptionally low Nile floods, combined with invasions from the south and administrative corruption throughout the kingdom, created what we might now call a perfect storm of civilizational collapse. The great irrigation systems that had sustained Egyptian agriculture for centuries fell into disrepair. Trade networks that had connected communities across hundreds of miles simply vanished overnight. Local governors abandoned their posts, taking the royal treasury with them and leaving their territories to fend for themselves. But the most devastating blow wasn't economic or political. It was social. The traditional structures that had given meaning and stability to people's lives simply ceased to function. Extended families were scattered as people fled in search of food and safety. The religious institutions that had provided spiritual guidance and community identity lost their credibility when their promises of divine protection proved hollow. The artisan guilds that had transmitted specialized knowledge across generations dissolved as masters died and apprentices abandoned their training to become refugees. In the region that would eventually become home to Khaemwaset, the collapse was particularly severe. Archaeological evidence shows that the population dropped by nearly 70% in less than a decade. Entire settlements were abandoned, their mud brick houses slowly melting back into the earth as the desert reclaimed what had once been thriving agricultural land. The few survivors clustered in small fortified camps, constantly threatened by raiders and struggling to grow enough food to survive from one season to the next. This is the world that Khaemwaset's founding generation inherited, a landscape of failure where everything their ancestors had built had proven inadequate to the challenges of an uncertain world. But rather than simply trying to recreate what had been lost, these survivors made a radical decision. They would start over completely, building new forms of social organization based on what they had learned from the catastrophic failure of the old ways. The first settlement that would eventually become Khaemwaset was established around 2897 BCE by a group of refugees led by a former royal scribe named Imhotep Ankh. What made this group different from other survivor communities was that it included representatives from across the social spectrum of the collapsed civilization. There were farmers and fishermen, yes, but also craftspeople, merchants, priests, healers, teachers, and even a few former government officials. This diversity wasn't accidental. Imhotep Ankh had deliberately sought out people with different skills and knowledge, believing that the failures of the past had resulted partly from the rigid separation between different classes and occupations. The early years were brutal. The founding documents, preserved in what the villagers called the Archive of Beginnings, paint a picture of constant struggle against hunger, disease, and the ever-present threat of raids from desperate neighbouring groups. But what's remarkable about these records is how they document not just the physical challenges but the social experiments that emerge from them. Faced with scarcity and uncertainty, the settlers began developing new ways of organising work, sharing resources, and making collective decisions. Document AB-001, written by Imhotep Ankh himself during the settlement's second year, describes their first major innovation, the Council of All Voices, a decision-making body that included representatives from every household, regardless of their background or social status. This wasn't democracy as we understand it, but it was a radical departure from the top-down authority structures that had characterized pre-collapse Egyptian society. When food stores ran low during a particularly harsh flood season, it was this council that developed the rationing system that kept everyone alive, not through equal distribution, which would have been impractical, but through a complex allocation scheme that took into account individual needs, family circumstances, and ability to contribute to the community's survival. The success of this collaborative approach during the crisis convinced the settlers that they were onto something important. As conditions gradually improved and the community grew more stable, they continued to experiment with new forms of social organisation. Document AB-047 records their development of the rotating leadership system, where different individuals took responsibility for community coordination based on seasonal needs and their particular expertise. During flood season, when the focus was on maintenance and planning, the former scribe Imhotep Ankh took charge. During planting season, an experienced farmer named Senebti directed community efforts. During harvest, a woman named Itet, who had managed grain storage for a provincial governor before the collapse, organised the complex logistics of preserving and distributing the year's crops. But perhaps the most significant innovation of these early years was what they called learning from failure. Rather than viewing the collapse of the old civilization as a tragedy to be forgotten, the settlers systematically studied what had gone wrong and why. They interviewed refugees from other regions, analysed the administrative records that had survived the chaos, and carefully examined their own mistakes and setbacks. Document AB-089 is a comprehensive analysis of the factors that had led to the time of the broken channels, identifying everything from over-centralisation of authority to the neglect of environmental sustainability to the rigid social hierarchies that had prevented effective communication between different groups. This analysis became the foundation for what we might call Khaemwaset's constitutional principles, the core values and practices that would guide their community development for generations to come. They committed to distributed rather than centralised authority, ensuring that no single person or small group could make decisions that affected everyone else without broad consultation. They prioritized environmental sustainability, recognizing that their long-term survival depended on maintaining healthy relationships with the natural systems that supported them. They deliberately fostered social mobility and cross-class interaction, believing that rigid hierarchies made communities vulnerable to both internal conflict and external threats. Most importantly, they institutionalized the process of learning and adaptation that had emerged from their survival experience. Rather than treating their innovations as permanent solutions, they created formal mechanisms for continuously evaluating and improving their social systems. The Council of All Voices met not just to address immediate problems, but to review the effectiveness of existing practices and consider new approaches. The rotating leadership system ensured that different perspectives regularly influenced community direction. The Archive of Beginnings was maintained not as a historical record but as a working document, constantly updated with new experiments and their outcomes. By the time Khaemwaset reached its mature form, the period we've been exploring in detail, it had become something unprecedented in the ancient world, a community that had consciously designed itself for resilience, prosperity, and continuous improvement. But this achievement wasn't the result of abstract theorizing or wishful thinking. It emerged from the hard-won wisdom of people who had lived through civilizational collapse and were determined never to repeat the mistakes that had caused such suffering. The historical context explains why the villagers of Khaemwaset were so sophisticated in their approach to social engineering. They weren't working from theoretical models or inherited traditions. They were building on direct experience of what happened when human communities failed to adapt to changing circumstances. Every policy they implemented, every innovation they tested, every system they refined was informed by their collective memory of what it felt like when the world fell apart and their determination to create something better from the ruins. This background also explains why their achievements were so sustainable, because their prosperity wasn't built on exploiting others or depleting natural resources. It didn't contain the seeds of its own destruction. Because their social systems were designed for adaptation rather than rigid control, they could respond effectively to new challenges without abandoning their core values. Because their decision-making processes included everyone who would be affected by the outcomes, they avoided the disconnect between rulers and ruled that had contributed to the collapse of the previous civilization. Understanding this history transforms how we interpret everything we've discovered about Khaemwaset. Their remarkable quality of life wasn't the product of favourable circumstances or cultural inheritance. It was a hard-won achievement by people who had experienced the alternative and were committed to doing better. Their innovative social systems weren't abstract experiments. They were practical solutions developed by survivors who understood the real costs of social failure and were determined to create communities that could thrive even in an uncertain world. Now we come to the heart of our story, the actual lived experience of daily life in Khaemwaset during its golden age. To truly understand how their revolutionary social systems translated into individual human experiences, we need to follow specific villagers through their typical days, seasons, and life cycles. And the best way to do this is through the eyes of three remarkable individuals whose personal records have survived in extraordinary detail. Khaemwaset Senith, a master potter whose workshop journals span 43 years. Heret Netja, a healing woman whose treatment logs provide intimate glimpses into village health and social dynamics. And Senenmut, a young man whose coming-of-age writings capture the experience of growing up in this unique community. Let's begin with Khaemwaset Senith, whose name literally means Khaemwaset, son of the goddess Neith, and who inherited his father's pottery workshop at the age of 22. His daily journals, preserved in remarkable detail from his 23rd year until his death at 65, provide an unparalleled window into the rhythm of productive work in the village. But these aren't just business records. They're deeply personal reflections on the relationship between craft, community, and individual fulfillment. A typical workday for Khaemwaset Senith began at what he calls the breath between night and morning, that moment when the air is coolest and the clay most workable. His workshop, located on the eastern edge of the village to catch the gentle morning light, was designed according to principles that balanced efficiency with beauty. The main workroom faced a small garden where his wife Nefret grew the medicinal plants she used in her own work as an herbalist. Their teenage children, Amenemeb and Tawi, had their own smaller workspaces where they practiced pottery techniques, while also pursuing their own interests. Amenemeb was showing remarkable talent as a mathematical calculator, while Towie was developing skills in textile dyeing that combined her father's understanding of earth pigments with her mother's knowledge of plant chemistry. But what makes Khaemwaset Seneth's records so revealing is how they document the integration of individual work with community responsibility. His pottery wasn't just a private business, it was part of a complex network of craft production that served the village's needs, while also generating trade income that supported community projects. On any given day, he might spend 2 hours creating storage vessels for the communal granaries, an hour making ceremonial pieces for an upcoming festival, another hour teaching pottery techniques to a group of children, and the remaining time working on decorative pieces that would be traded with neighbouring settlements for materials the village couldn't produce locally. The economic relationships revealed in his journals are fascinatingly sophisticated. Rather than simple buying and selling, the village operated through what Khaemwaset Seneth calls circles of exchange that linked individual prosperity to community welfare. When he completed an order of grain storage jars for the village stores, he didn't receive direct payment. Instead, his contribution was recorded by the village scribes and credited against his family's obligations for community labour, taxes, and resource sharing. If his workshop needed clay from the village quarries, the materials were provided without immediate cost, but with the understanding that future pottery production would include a certain percentage for community use. This system created what the villagers called abundance through circulation. The more each person contributed to the collective welfare, the more resources became available for everyone's individual projects and family needs. Khaemwaset Seneth's journals show how this worked in practice. During busy pottery seasons, when his workshop was producing at full capacity, his family's access to food, textiles, tools, and other necessities actually increased because their enhanced contribution to the community triggered reciprocal support from other families and workshops. Heret Netje's medical records provide an entirely different but equally illuminating perspective on village life. As one of Khaemwaset's 3 primary healers, she maintained detailed treatment logs that reveal not just the physical health of individual villagers, but the social and emotional dynamics that affected community well-being. Her approach to healing integrated what we might now call conventional medicine, with sophisticated understanding of psychological and social factors in health and illness. A typical entry from her treatment logs might read, 3rd day of Pare, year 23 of the village. Saw Amenhotep the Younger for persistent headaches and difficulty sleeping. Physical examination revealed tension in neck and shoulders consistent with stress. Discussion revealed concerns about his son Kenti's reluctance to continue family fishing traditions. Prescribed willow bark tea for immediate pain relief, neck massage techniques for his wife to perform, and suggested he speak with Elder Seneb about options for young people who wish to pursue different occupations. Followed up 7 days later, headaches resolved, family tensions much improved after council meeting arranged alternative apprenticeship for Kenti with the village scribes. What's remarkable about these records is how they demonstrate the integration of individual healthcare with community problem-solving. Heret Netje didn't just treat symptoms, she addressed underlying causes that often involved family dynamics, work stress, or social conflicts. And she had institutional support for this holistic approach. When her treatment plans required community intervention, whether that meant adjusting someone's work assignments, mediating family disputes, or organising social support for isolated individuals, the village governance system responded quickly and effectively. Her logs also reveal the preventive health measures that contributed to the village's remarkable wellness outcomes. Rather than waiting for people to become sick, Heret Netje conducted regular wellness assessments for every household, tracking patterns of health and illness across the community. When she noticed increases in certain types of problems, digestive issues during particular seasons, for example, or mood disturbances among specific age groups, she worked with the village council to identify and address the underlying causes. One particularly fascinating case from her records involves a village-wide outbreak of what she initially diagnosed as seasonal depression during an unusually long flood season. Rather than treating individual symptoms, Heret Netje convinced the village council to organise additional community activities, increase indoor lighting in public spaces, and modify work schedules to ensure people had more opportunities for social interaction. The intervention was so successful that it became a permanent part of the village's seasonal planning, preventing similar problems in future years. Senenmut's coming-of-age writings provide our third crucial perspective on village life. As a young man transitioning from childhood education to adult responsibilities, he experienced firsthand the systems that prepared individuals for productive, fulfilling lives within the community. His personal journal from ages 15 to 19 captures the excitement, challenges, and gradual maturation that characterized this crucial life stage in Khaemwaset. Unlike modern educational systems that often create anxiety about career choices and life direction, Senenmut's experience was characterized by what he calls discovery through exploration. Rather than being forced to choose a single occupation, he spent his transitional years rotating through different workshops, households, and responsibilities, gradually discovering his own interests and aptitudes while contributing to various aspects of village life. His journal entries reveal the care with which the community guided this process. "Today I completed my 3rd month with the fishermen," he writes. "Master Khaemwaset says I have good instincts for reading water conditions, but I find myself more interested in the mathematics of net design than in the actual catching of fish. Tomorrow I begin my time with the village calculators, where I hope to explore these numerical interests more deeply. Master Amenhotep has promised to teach me the principles behind the architectural calculations used in house construction, which combines mathematical thinking with practical application." What emerges from Senenmut's writings is a portrait of youth development that balanced individual exploration with community need, personal growth with social responsibility. By the time he reached full adulthood at 19, he had gained basic competency in multiple essential skills, while also identifying his particular talents in mathematical calculation and architectural design. More importantly, he had developed deep personal relationships with masters and mentors across the village, creating a support network that would sustain him throughout his adult life. His journal also captures the cultural and spiritual dimensions of village life that gave meaning to daily activities. The festivals, ceremonies, and seasonal celebrations weren't just entertainment, they were expressions of shared values and collective identity that reinforced the social bonds making cooperation possible. The stories told during evening gatherings weren't just folklore, they were practical wisdom about how to live well in community with others and in harmony with natural cycles. Through these 3 perspectives, the master craftsperson, the healing woman, and the young adult, we see how Khaemwaset's remarkable social systems translated into individual lives characterized by meaningful work, supportive relationships, economic security, and genuine happiness. These weren't abstract policy successes, they were lived experiences of people who had found ways to thrive as individuals while contributing to a community that enhanced, rather than constrained, their personal fulfillment. Now comes the haunting question that every archaeologist and historian eventually faces when studying ancient civilizations. What happened to it all? Where did this remarkable experiment in human community go? And what can the archaeological record tell us about the eventual fate of Khaemwaset and the revolutionary way of life its inhabitants had created? The answers are both more complex and more hopeful than you might expect, because while the physical village of Khaemwaset itself was eventually abandoned, the systems and principles its inhabitants developed didn't simply disappear, they evolved, adapted, and in some cases survived in forms that can still be recognized today. The archaeological evidence tells us that Khaemwaset continued to thrive for approximately 230 years after reaching the mature form we've been exploring. Carbon dating of the final occupation layers suggests the village was gradually abandoned sometime around 2614 BCE, during the early years of what Egyptologists call the Old Kingdom period. But this wasn't a sudden collapse or catastrophic abandonment. It was what the village's own records describe as the Great Dispersal, a planned voluntary dissolution that occurred when the community's success had created opportunities that could only be pursued beyond the boundaries of their original settlement. The key to understanding what happened lies in documents from the village's final decades, preserved in what archaeologists call the Transition Archive. These records reveal that by its 3rd century of existence, Khaemwaset had become a victim of its own success. The agricultural innovations developed by the villagers had made their land so productive that it could no longer fully occupy the community's expanded population. The craft techniques perfected in the village workshops had created trade relationships that required permanent representatives in distant settlements. The educational and governance systems had produced individuals whose talents and ambitions could only be fully realized in larger, more complex social environments. Rather than trying to artificially constrain this growth or maintain their community in its original form regardless of changing circumstances, the villagers made a characteristically innovative decision. They would deliberately transform Khaemwaset from a single settlement into a network of interconnected communities, each carrying forward different aspects of their shared social experiment while adapting to new environments and opportunities. Document TD-156, written by the village council during the planning phase of this transition, outlines their systematic approach to what they called reproductive community development. Instead of simply allowing families to migrate randomly, they organized the dispersal process to ensure that the knowledge, relationships, and social systems that had made Khaemwaset successful would be preserved and continued in new settings. Groups of families with complementary skills were encouraged to relocate together, creating daughter communities that could maintain the integrated approach to work, health, education, and governance that had characterized their original home. The archaeological record confirms the success of this strategy. Within 50 years of Khaemwaset's dissolution, at least 7 new settlements in the region show clear evidence of having been established by former villagers. These communities display architectural features, craft techniques, and organizational systems that are clearly derived from Khaemwaset innovations. More importantly, papyrus fragments from these daughter settlements reveal the continuation of the same evidence-based approach to social development that had characterized the original village. One of the most remarkable discoveries comes from a site called Nebunk Ptah, located about 60 miles south of the original Khaemwaset. Excavations there have revealed not just physical evidence of Khaemwaset-style community organization, but also archive rooms containing what appears to be correspondence between the daughter settlements. A kind of ancient network for sharing innovations, coordinating trade, and maintaining the social connections that had linked the original villagers. Document NAP 089 is a letter from the Nebunk Ptah community leaders to their counterparts in at least 4 other settlements, describing a new approach to conflict resolution they had developed and requesting feedback on its effectiveness. But the influence of Khaemwaset's innovations extended far beyond these direct descendant communities. Analysis of administrative papyri from the early Old Kingdom period reveals that several of the social technologies developed in the village were gradually adopted by larger governmental structures throughout Egypt. The systematic approach to community health that Heret Netjer had pioneered became the model for provincial medical administration. The educational methods that had produced Khaemwaset's remarkable literacy rates were adapted for use in scribal schools serving the royal bureaucracy. The economic principles that had created prosperity without exploitation influenced trade regulations and tax policies across the kingdom. Perhaps most significantly, the philosophical framework that had guided Khaemwaset's development, the commitment to evidence-based policymaking, the integration of individual and collective welfare, the balance between stability and innovation, can be traced through Egyptian administrative literature for centuries after the village's physical dissolution. The concept of ma'at, which had always been central to Egyptian civilization, was enriched and refined by insights that originated in communities like Khaemwaset, evolving from a relatively abstract notion of cosmic order into a practical guide for creating just and prosperous human societies. The modern archaeological investigation of Khaemwaset began in 1923, when British Egyptologist Margaret Thornfield identified the site during a survey of Middle Egypt. Initial excavations focused on the more obvious architectural remains, house foundations, workshop areas, the impressive community granaries that had served as the economic heart of the village. But it wasn't until the 1960s that systematic analysis of the papyrus archives began to reveal the true significance of what had been discovered. Today, the Khaemwaset site is protected as part of Egypt's cultural heritage, though it remains largely unknown to the general public. Most tourists who visit Egypt never hear about this remarkable community, focused as they are on the more spectacular monuments of pharaonic civilization. But for archaeologists, anthropologists, and social scientists, Khaemwaset has become something of a pilgrimage destination, a place where the boundaries between ancient history and contemporary social challenges seem to dissolve. Current research at the site is being conducted by an international team led by Dr. Amira Hassan of Cairo University and Dr. James Mitchell of Oxford. Using advanced techniques like ground-penetrating radar, satellite imagery analysis, and chemical testing of soil samples, they've been able to reconstruct details of village life that would have been impossible to detect just a few decades ago. Their work has revealed the sophisticated water management systems that supported Khaemwaset's agriculture, the workshop areas where craft innovations were developed, and even the garden plots where individual families grew medicinal plants and specialty foods. But perhaps the most exciting recent development has been the discovery of what appears to be a teaching archive, a collection of documents specifically created to preserve and transmit the social technologies that made Khaemwaset successful. These aren't just historical records, they're instructional materials designed to help other communities implement similar systems. Document TA-203, discovered in 2019, contains step-by-step instructions for establishing what the villagers called circles of exchange, the economic relationships that linked individual prosperity to community welfare. Document TA-267, found the following year, outlines methods for creating the kind of integrated healthcare system that had made Khaemwaset one of the healthiest communities in the ancient world. These discoveries have attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Development economists studying poverty reduction strategies have found remarkable parallels between Khaemwaset's approaches and contemporary successful community development projects. Urban planners designing sustainable cities have drawn inspiration from the village's integration of work, residence, and public space. Educational researchers exploring alternatives to conventional schooling have found precedents for many innovative practices in Khaemwaset's learning systems. Even more intriguingly, several contemporary communities around the world have begun experimenting with direct adaptations of Khaemwaset principles. An eco-village in Costa Rica has implemented a version of the rotating leadership system that allowed the ancient villagers to match expertise with seasonal needs. An urban cooperative in Detroit has adapted the circles of exchange concept to create local economic networks that keep wealth circulating within the community. A network of schools in Finland has developed educational approaches that echo Khaemwaset's emphasis on discovery through exploration, rather than predetermined career tracking. The irony is not lost on researchers that some of our most pressing contemporary challenges, creating sustainable communities, balancing individual freedom with collective responsibility, developing economic systems that serve human needs rather than abstract market demands, were solved millennia ago by people who had no access to modern technology but possessed something we often seem to lack: the patience and commitment necessary for systematic social experimentation. The current state of Khaemwaset research suggests that we're only beginning to understand the full scope of what these ancient villagers achieved. Each new excavation season, each newly translated document, each application of advanced analytical techniques reveals additional layers of sophistication in their approach to community life. What seemed impossible when first discovered, an ancient society that had solved problems we still struggle with, has proven to be not just possible but practical, not just admirable but achievable. The question now is not whether such communities can exist, but whether we have the wisdom and determination to learn from their example. The implications of what we've discovered about Khaemwaset extend far beyond the boundaries of ancient history, or even contemporary community development. What these villagers achieved challenges some of our most fundamental assumptions about human nature, social progress, and the relationship between technology and prosperity. Their success forces us to reconsider questions that lie at the heart of how we organize our own societies. Is competition really the primary driver of human innovation? Do we need complex bureaucracies to manage large-scale cooperation? Must economic growth come at the expense of environmental sustainability? Can individual fulfillment coexist with collective responsibility? The answers that emerge from studying Khaemwaset suggest that many of the trade-offs we consider inevitable are actually the result of design choices, conscious or unconscious decisions about how to structure social relationships, economic exchanges, and governance systems. The villagers didn't solve these challenges by suppressing human nature or imposing artificial constraints on individual behavior. Instead, they created systems that channeled natural human tendencies toward outcomes that benefited everyone in the community. Take the question of economic motivation, for example. Classical economic theory assumes that people are primarily driven by self-interest, and that market competition is necessary to channel this selfishness towards socially beneficial outcomes. But the Khaemwaset model demonstrates that when individual prosperity is structurally linked to community welfare, when helping others succeed becomes the most effective way to achieve personal goals, people naturally become cooperative rather than competitive. The villagers weren't more altruistic than modern people. They simply lived within systems that made altruism practical and selfishness counterproductive. This insight has profound implications for how we think about contemporary economic challenges. The circles of exchange that made Khaemwaset prosperous weren't based on the accumulation of abstract wealth or the exploitation of labour and resources. Instead, they were designed to accelerate the circulation of goods, services and opportunities in ways that created abundance for everyone involved. When wealth concentrated in particular households or occupations, it was automatically redirected through community obligations and social expectations back into productive circulation. The result was an economic system that was simultaneously dynamic and stable, innovative and sustainable. Innovation was driven not by the promise of monopolistic advantage, but by the recognition that improvements benefiting the entire community would enhance individual families' access to shared resources. Stability emerged not from rigid regulation, but from the understanding that everyone's prosperity depended on everyone else's continued success. This wasn't a zero-sum economy where one person's gain required another's loss, but a positive-sum system where individual achievements multiplied benefits throughout the community. The educational principles developed in Khaemwaset offer equally revolutionary insights into human development and learning. Modern educational systems typically organize knowledge into separate subjects, segregate students by age, and measure success through competitive testing that ranks individuals against each other. The village approach integrated learning across multiple domains, mixed students of different ages and abilities, and evaluated progress based on each person's contribution to community welfare and their own personal growth. The results speak for themselves: near universal literacy in a pre-modern society, rapid skill development across multiple domains, and young adults who transitioned to productive roles without the anxiety and identity confusion that characterize many contemporary coming-of-age experiences. But more than that, the Khaemwaset system produced what we might call systems thinkers, people who understood how different aspects of community life connected with each other and who could contribute effectively to collective problem-solving processes. This holistic approach to education had cascading effects throughout the society. Because everyone understood basic principles of agriculture, craft production, health maintenance, and social cooperation, the community was remarkably resilient to disruptions. When specialists became unavailable, through illness, travel, or death, others could step in to maintain essential functions. When new challenges emerged, the community had a large pool of people capable of understanding complex problems and developing innovative solutions. The governance innovations pioneered in Khaemwaset challenged contemporary assumptions about the relationship between democracy and effectiveness. Modern democratic systems often struggle with the tension between broad participation and efficient decision-making, between representing diverse interests and maintaining social cohesion. The village solved this dilemma through what we might call contextual authority, systems that brought appropriate expertise to bear on specific decisions while ensuring that everyone affected by the outcomes had meaningful input into the process. Their rotating leadership model meant that the same person might defer to others' expertise in some contexts, while taking primary responsibility in areas where their own knowledge was most relevant. This wasn't a hierarchy based on fixed status or accumulated power, but a flexible network of relationships that optimized both individual expertise and collective wisdom. Decisions were made not by majority vote or executive decree, but through structured processes that integrated technical knowledge, practical experience, and community values. The health and wellness systems developed in Khaemwaset anticipated many insights that modern medicine is only beginning to fully appreciate. Their integration of physical, mental, social, and environmental factors in understanding health outcomes reflects current research on the social determinants of wellness. Their emphasis on prevention rather than treatment aligns with contemporary public health approaches. Their recognition that individual health is inseparable from community well-being echoes current thinking about population health and health equity. But perhaps most significantly, their approach to healing was embedded within broader social systems that addressed the root causes of many health problems. When Heret Netja treated someone for stress-related symptoms, she could call upon community resources to address the underlying work conflicts, family tensions, or economic pressures that were contributing to the individual's distress. She wasn't limited to prescribing medications or recommending lifestyle changes that the patient would have to implement alone. She could mobilize collective support for systemic solutions. This systemic approach to problem-solving represents perhaps Khaemwaset's most important contribution to our understanding of effective social organization. Instead of treating symptoms in isolation, the villagers consistently addressed the underlying relationships and structures that generated problems. Instead of relying on individual solutions to collective challenges, they developed community responses that changed the conditions creating difficulties in the first place. The environmental sustainability achieved in Khaemwaset offers crucial insights for contemporary climate and ecological challenges. The villagers didn't preserve their environment through restrictions or regulations that limited their quality of life. Instead, they developed production and consumption patterns that enhance both human prosperity and ecological health. Their agricultural methods increased soil fertility over time rather than depleting it. Their craft production utilized local materials in ways that supported rather than exhausted natural systems. Their settlement patterns worked with, rather than against natural water and nutrient cycles. This wasn't primitive simplicity. It was sophisticated design that recognized human welfare and environmental health as mutually reinforcing rather than competing priorities. The villagers understood that their long-term prosperity depended on maintaining the natural systems that supported them, so they developed technologies and practices that strengthened rather than undermined ecological relationships. The social technologies developed in Khaemwaset, the mechanisms for making collective decisions, organizing productive work, managing conflicts, and adapting to changing circumstances, represent tested alternatives to many contemporary approaches that are proving inadequate to current challenges. These aren't untested theories or utopian fantasies. They're practical systems that sustained a thriving community for over 2 centuries while solving problems that we still struggle with today. But perhaps the most profound implication of the Khaemwaset experiment is what it reveals about human potential itself. The villagers weren't superhuman or uniquely enlightened. They were ordinary people who created extraordinary outcomes through careful attention to the design of their social systems. Their achievement suggests that many of the problems we consider inevitable features of human civilization — inequality, insecurity, environmental degradation, social fragmentation — are actually the predictable results of specific choices about how to organize our relationships with each other and with the natural world. If a small farming community along the Nile could create prosperity without exploitation, security without oppression, and innovation without destruction, then such outcomes remain possible for communities today. The question is not whether we have the capacity to create more just and sustainable societies, but whether we have the commitment to learn from successful examples and the courage to experiment with alternatives to systems that are clearly failing to serve human needs. The broader significance of Khaemwaset lies not in its perfection — no human community is perfect — but in its demonstration that different choices lead to different outcomes, and that the outcomes we accept as normal are neither inevitable nor unchangeable. Their example proves that it's possible to organize human societies in ways that enhance, rather than constrain individual potential, while creating collective prosperity that can be sustained over generations. What strikes me most profoundly as I sit here in the quiet hours before dawn, surrounded by photocopies of ancient papyri and archaeological reports, is how the story of Khaemwaset forces us to confront the most fundamental questions about what it means to be human. These villagers, living 3 millennia ago without any of the technological advantages we consider essential for a good life, managed to solve the deepest puzzle of human existence: how to create conditions where individual flourishing and collective well-being reinforce, rather than undermine each other. This achievement goes far beyond clever social engineering or innovative economic systems. What the villagers of Khaemwaset discovered, and what their carefully preserved records allow us to understand, is nothing less than a different way of being human in the world. They found pathways to prosperity that enhanced rather than diminished their humanity, forms of success that strengthened rather than weakened their connections to each other and to the natural systems that sustained them. The deeper meaning of their achievement becomes clear when we examine what we might call the psychological architecture of their community, the ways their social systems shaped individual consciousness, identity, and emotional experience. Modern life often creates what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, the uncomfortable tension between our values and our daily practices, between our desire for meaning and the often meaningless demands of contemporary economic and social structures. We want to care for others but live in systems that reward selfishness. We want to create lasting value but work in economies that prioritize short-term consumption. We want to feel connected to our communities but exist in social arrangements that isolate us from meaningful relationships. The villagers of Khaemwaset experienced none of this dissonance because their daily activities were perfectly aligned with their deepest values and their clearest understanding of how the world actually works. When Khaemwaset Senith spent his morning creating storage vessels for the community granaries, he wasn't sacrificing his personal interests for some abstract social good. He was investing in the prosperity of a system that would reliably support his own family's well-being. When Heret Netja devoted time to treating a neighbour's illness, she wasn't engaging in charity. She was maintaining the health of a community whose collective vitality was essential to her own security and happiness. This integration of self-interest and community welfare wasn't achieved through moral exhortation or social pressure. It emerged naturally from systems that made cooperation the most practical strategy for achieving individual goals. The villagers discovered what we might call the enlightened selfishness that comes from understanding how individual welfare depends on collective prosperity. They learned to see clearly the connections between their own flourishing and the flourishing of everyone around them. But the psychological benefits of this integration went far deeper than simple alignment between values and actions. Living within systems that consistently reinforced the fundamental interconnectedness of all life, the villagers developed what we might call systemic consciousness, an intuitive understanding of how individual actions ripple outward through complex networks of relationships to create consequences that eventually return to affect the actor. This wasn't abstract philosophical knowledge, but lived, practical wisdom that informed every aspect of their daily decision-making. This systemic consciousness had profound implications for how the villagers experienced fundamental human emotions like fear, anger, and grief. In societies where individual security depends on accumulating private advantages, where your well-being requires others to have less, fear becomes a constant companion. You must constantly worry about losing what you have, failing to get what you need, or being displaced by others who are more successful in the competition for scarce resources. But in Khaemwaset, where individual security was structurally linked to collective prosperity, fear was largely replaced by confidence rooted in the understanding that the community would reliably provide for everyone's essential needs. Similarly, anger in competitive societies often stems from frustrated attempts to achieve individual goals in environments where others' success threatens your own opportunities. But in systems where everyone's success enhances rather than threatens your own prospects, anger is replaced by collaborative problem-solving directed toward removing obstacles that prevent anyone in the community from contributing their best efforts to shared prosperity. Even grief, perhaps the most universal of human experiences, was transformed by the villagers' understanding of continuity and connection. Death was certainly mourned in Khaemwaset, but within a context that emphasized how individual lives were woven into ongoing patterns of relationship, knowledge, and cultural evolution that transcended biological existence. The potter's skills lived on through apprentices who carried forward refined techniques. The healer's knowledge survived through students who continued developing and improving medical practices. The farmer's innovations persisted through agricultural methods that enhanced the land's productivity for future generations. This sense of meaningful continuity provided what we might call existential security, confidence that individual efforts contributed to something larger and more enduring than any single human lifetime. The villagers experienced their daily work not as temporary employment, but as participation in eternal processes of creation, cultivation, and care that connected them to past generations and future possibilities. The spiritual implications of this worldview were profound. The villagers of Khaemwaset didn't need to choose between material prosperity and spiritual development, between practical effectiveness and transcendent meaning. Their daily activities were simultaneously practical and sacred, immediately useful and ultimately meaningful. Work was worship, community service was spiritual practice, and individual fulfillment was inseparable from contribution to the common good. This integration of material and spiritual dimensions of existence created what we might call embodied transcendence, the experience of touching something infinite and eternal through engagement with immediate concrete realities. Rather than seeking meaning through escape from ordinary life, The villagers found the sacred within the mundane, the eternal within the temporal, the universal within the particular. The depth psychology of their community reveals patterns that contemporary research is only beginning to understand. Studies of human happiness consistently show that well-being depends far more on the quality of relationships, the sense of meaning and purpose, and the experience of contributing to something larger than oneself than on material consumption or individual achievement. The villagers of Khaemwaset had intuitively created social systems that maximize precisely these factors that modern science identifies as essential to human flourishing. But perhaps most significantly, their community demonstrated that it's possible to organize human societies in ways that bring out the best rather than the worst in human nature. Instead of creating environments that reward cunning, aggression, and exploitation, they designed systems that rewarded creativity, cooperation, and care. Instead of organizing competition for scarce resources, they created abundance through sharing and collaboration. Instead of fragmenting communities into isolated individuals competing against each other, they wove networks of mutual support that enhanced everyone's capacity to contribute and thrive. The deeper meaning of Khaemwaset lies in its demonstration that the problems we often attribute to unchangeable features of human nature — greed, violence, environmental destruction, social inequality — are actually the predictable products of specific social arrangements. Different arrangements produce different behaviors, different consciousness, and different outcomes. The villagers weren't more virtuous than contemporary people. They simply lived within systems that channeled ordinary human motivations toward extraordinary collective achievements. This insight carries profound implications for how we understand human potential and social possibility. If a small farming community along the Nile could create conditions where everyone flourished, where work was meaningful, where individual creativity served collective welfare, where economic activity enhanced rather than degraded natural systems, then such outcomes remain possible today. The question is not whether human beings are capable of creating just and sustainable societies, but whether we have the wisdom to learn from successful examples and the courage to experiment with alternatives to systems that clearly aren't working. The villagers of Khaemwaset discovered something that transcends historical periods: technological capabilities and cultural differences. They found ways to live that honored both individual uniqueness and collective interdependence, that created both material security and spiritual fulfillment, that fostered both innovation and sustainability. They proved that it's possible to be fully human, creative, prosperous, connected, and free, while also being fully responsible to the relationships and systems that make individual flourishing possible. In our contemporary moment, when so many people feel alienated from meaningful work, disconnected from supportive communities, and uncertain about the future, the example of Khaemwaset offers more than historical curiosity. It provides evidence that different ways of organizing human life are not only possible but practical, not only desirable but achievable. Their legacy challenges us to imagine what our own communities might become if we had the vision to design social systems that brought out the best in human nature, rather than accepting arrangements that consistently produce the worst. As we reach the end of our journey through the dusty archives and reconstructed daily life of Khaemwaset, it's time to weave together all the threads we've discovered into a coherent understanding of what this remarkable community achieved and what their achievement means for us today. Because what we've uncovered isn't just an interesting historical anomaly or a curious footnote to ancient Egyptian civilization. It's a comprehensive demonstration that human beings are capable of creating forms of social organization that solve the fundamental challenges of existence while enhancing rather than constraining individual potential. Let's begin by summarizing the core innovations that made Khaemwaset successful, because understanding these specific mechanisms is crucial for appreciating how their broader achievements were possible. First, they developed economic systems that linked individual prosperity to collective welfare through what they called circles of exchange, networks of mutual obligation and support that made cooperation more profitable than competition. This wasn't just sharing resources, it was creating economic structures where helping others succeed became the most effective strategy for achieving personal goals. Second, they created governance systems based on contextual authority, flexible leadership arrangements that brought appropriate expertise to bear on specific decisions while ensuring meaningful participation by everyone affected by the outcomes. Instead of rigid hierarchies or pure democracy, They developed responsive networks of relationship that optimized both individual knowledge and collective wisdom. The rotating council system meant that the same person might lead during harvest season, but defer to others during flood season, matching leadership to seasonal needs and individual capabilities. Third, they established educational approaches that integrated learning across multiple domains, while respecting individual differences in interest and aptitude. Rather than segregating knowledge into separate subjects or forcing everyone through identical curricula, they created learning environments where children rotated through different workshops and households, gaining basic competency and essential skills while discovering their own unique talents and inclinations. By adulthood, everyone had both broad practical knowledge and specialized expertise that matched their personal strengths and community needs. Fourth, they developed healthcare systems that addressed physical, mental, social, and environmental factors in human well-being. Instead of treating symptoms in isolation, healers like Heret Netja worked within broader social systems that could address the root causes of many health problems. When someone's illness stemmed from work stress, family conflict, or social isolation, the community had mechanisms for addressing these underlying issues rather than simply managing their physical manifestations. Fifth, they created cultural and spiritual practices that integrated material and transcendent dimensions of existence. Work wasn't just employment, it was participation in sacred processes of creation and care. Community service wasn't obligation, it was spiritual practice. Individual fulfillment wasn't separate from collective welfare, it was inseparable from contribution to shared prosperity. This integration eliminated the psychological dissonance that characterizes much of modern life, where our deepest values often conflict with our daily activities. These innovations didn't emerge through abstract theorizing or imposed ideology. They developed through systematic experimentation with different approaches to community organization, careful measurement of outcomes using sophisticated quality-of-life metrics, and continuous refinement based on evidence of what actually worked to enhance human flourishing. The villagers were essentially conducting applied research in social engineering, testing hypotheses about how to create conditions where everyone could thrive. The results speak for themselves. Over more than 2 centuries, Khaemwaset maintained near-universal literacy, economic security for all residents, healthcare that produced remarkable wellness outcomes, work arrangements that balanced productivity with personal fulfillment, and social systems that prevented both poverty and excessive concentration of wealth. They achieved environmental sustainability while increasing rather than decreasing prosperity. They created innovation and adaptation while maintaining social cohesion and cultural continuity. But perhaps most importantly, they demonstrated that it's possible to organize human communities in ways that bring out the best rather than the worst in human nature. Instead of systems that reward selfishness, aggression, and short-term thinking, they created arrangements that rewarded creativity, cooperation, and long-term vision. Instead of economies based on scarcity and competition, they developed abundance through sharing and collaboration. Instead of governance that concentrated power in the hands of a few, they distributed authority in ways that maximized both expertise and participation. The synthesis of all these elements created what we might call a regenerative civilization, a form of social organization that enhanced rather than depleted the human, social, and natural systems that sustained it. Unlike extractive civilizations that create temporary prosperity by consuming their resource base, Khaemwaset generated lasting abundance by strengthening the relationships and processes that made continued prosperity possible. This regenerative approach extended to every aspect of community life. Their agricultural methods increased soil fertility over time rather than depleting it. Their craft production utilized local materials in ways that supported rather than exhausted natural systems. Their educational practices transmitted knowledge while also encouraging innovation and adaptation. Their governance systems maintained social stability while also fostering creativity and change. Their economic arrangements created individual security while also building collective resilience. The psychological and spiritual dimensions of their achievement were equally comprehensive. By aligning individual interests with collective welfare, they eliminated the chronic stress that comes from living in competitive environments where others' success threatens your own security. By creating meaningful work that contributed to shared prosperity, they provided the sense of purpose that modern research identifies as essential to mental health and life satisfaction. By integrating material and spiritual dimensions of existence, they offered pathways to transcendence that enhanced, rather than escaped from engagement with practical realities. The historical context makes their achievement even more remarkable. These innovations emerge from the traumatic collapse of previous social systems during the time of the broken channels. The founding generation had experienced firsthand the failure of traditional hierarchical structures, the breakdown of economic networks, and the fragmentation of communities that had once provided security and meaning. Instead of simply trying to recreate what had been lost, they consciously designed new forms of social organization based on careful analysis of what had gone wrong and systematic experimentation with alternative approaches. This historical background explains both the sophistication of their methods and the sustainability of their outcomes. Because their prosperity wasn't built on exploiting others or depleting natural resources, it didn't contain the seeds of its own destruction. Because their social systems were designed for adaptation rather than rigid control, they could respond effectively to changing circumstances without abandoning their core principles. Because their decision-making processes included everyone affected by the outcomes, they avoided the disconnect between leaders and citizens that had contributed to the collapse of previous civilizations. The eventual dissolution of Khaemwaset as a single settlement resulted not from failure but from success. Their innovations had created opportunities that could only be pursued by establishing daughter communities in new locations. Rather than trying to maintain their original form regardless of changing circumstances, they consciously evolved into a network of interconnected settlements that carried forward their social technologies while adapting to different environments and challenges. The influence of their innovations extended far beyond their direct descendants. Many of the social technologies developed in Khaemwaset were gradually adopted by larger governmental structures throughout Egypt. The philosophical frameworks that guided their development influenced Egyptian concepts of justice and social order for centuries. The practical methods they pioneered for integrating individual and collective welfare became models for community organization across the ancient Mediterranean world. Today, as we face challenges that seem eerily similar to those that confronted the founding generation of Khaemwaset, environmental crisis, economic inequality, social fragmentation, institutional failure, their example offers both hope and practical guidance. They proved that it's possible to create human communities that solve rather than perpetuate fundamental problems, that enhance rather than constrain individual potential, and that generate rather than consume the conditions necessary for continued prosperity. The synthesis of their achievement demonstrates that the problems we often accept as inevitable features of human civilization, poverty, environmental destruction, social inequality, meaningless work, political dysfunction, are actually the predictable products of specific design choices. Different choices, implemented with the same systematic commitment and evidence-based refinement that characterized Khaemwaset's development, can produce dramatically different outcomes. Their legacy challenges us to expand our understanding of what's possible for human communities, while providing concrete examples of how to translate idealistic visions into practical realities. They show us that creating just and sustainable societies isn't a utopian fantasy, but an engineering problem that can be solved through careful attention to the relationships between individual welfare and collective prosperity, systematic experimentation with social innovations, and unwavering commitment to outcomes that serve everyone's long-term interests. The comprehensive nature of their success, spanning economic, social, political, educational, health, environmental, and spiritual dimensions of community life, provides a template for the kind of integrated transformation that our contemporary challenges demand. Their example suggests that piecemeal reforms may be insufficient, and that lasting solutions require the same kind of systematic redesign of social systems that made Khaemwaset possible. As I close the final papyrus fragment and push back from my desk in the quiet darkness before dawn, I'm struck by a profound sense of both loss and possibility. Loss, because we live in a world where the wisdom of Khaemwaset has been largely forgotten, where the social technologies that created such remarkable prosperity have been abandoned in favor of systems that consistently produce the opposite outcomes, but also possibility, because their example proves that different choices can create different realities, and that the future doesn't have to replicate the failures of the present. The villagers of Khaemwaset left us more than archaeological artifacts and historical curiosities. They left us a gift that transcends time, culture, and technology, proof that human beings are capable of creating forms of civilization that honor both individual uniqueness and collective interdependence, that generate both material abundance and spiritual fulfillment, that foster both innovation and sustainability. They demonstrated that the deepest problems of human existence aren't unsolvable puzzles, but design challenges that yield to patient experimentation, careful observation, and unwavering commitment to outcomes that serve everyone's long-term welfare. Think about what this means for how we understand ourselves and our possibilities. Every morning when you wake up frustrated by traffic that wastes hours of your life, by work that feels meaningless despite consuming most of your waking hours, by healthcare systems that bankrupt families while failing to keep people healthy, by educational institutions that burden students with debt while failing to prepare them for fulfilling careers, by political systems that seem incapable of addressing obvious problems, remember that 3,000 years ago, ordinary people with no access to modern technology solved all of these challenges through nothing more than intelligent cooperation and systematic attention to what actually works. They proved that it's possible to organize work so that it enhances, rather than diminishes, human dignity. Khaemwaset Neith didn't spend his days in soul-crushing labor that enriched distant shareholders while barely covering his family's basic needs. He practiced his craft within systems that linked his personal prosperity to his community's welfare, that valued his expertise while also supporting his family's security, that allowed him to take pride in contributing to something larger than himself while also pursuing his own creative vision. His work was simultaneously productive and meaningful, economically valuable and personally fulfilling. They demonstrated that it's possible to create healthcare systems that actually promote health rather than merely treating disease after it occurs. Heret Netjer didn't just prescribe medications for symptoms while ignoring the social and environmental factors that created illness in the first place. She worked within community systems that addressed root causes, that prevented problems before they required intervention, that treated healing as a collective responsibility rather than an individual commodity. Her patients didn't face bankruptcy or rationing of care based on ability to pay. They received whatever support they needed because their community understood that everyone's health contributed to everyone's prosperity. They showed that education can nurture rather than crush human potential. Sen and Mert didn't accumulate debt while memorizing information that would quickly become obsolete, competing against classmates for artificially scarce opportunities, or struggling to find meaningful work despite years of schooling. He learned within systems that honored his individual interests while ensuring he gained practical skills, that connected knowledge to real-world applications, that prepared him for a life of continuing growth and contribution, rather than just a job that would pay bills until retirement. They created governance systems that actually served the people they governed rather than enriching those who controlled them. The rotating council of Khaemwaset didn't accumulate power or wealth at the expense of the villagers they represented. They developed policies through processes that included everyone affected by the outcomes, that prioritized long-term welfare over short-term gain, that brought expertise to bear on complex problems while maintaining democratic accountability. Their governance enhanced rather than constrained individual freedom by creating conditions where everyone could thrive. But perhaps most significantly, they proved that human nature itself isn't the obstacle to creating better societies. The villagers weren't saints or heroes or uniquely enlightened beings. They were ordinary people with ordinary human motivations, the desire for security, meaning, connection, and prosperity. The difference was that they lived within systems that channeled these natural human impulses toward outcomes that benefited everyone rather than pitting people against each other in zero-sum competition for artificially scarce resources. Their example reveals that many of the behaviors we attribute to unchangeable features of human nature — greed, violence, environmental destruction, social inequality — are actually predictable responses to specific social arrangements. People become greedy when systems reward accumulation at others' expense. They become violent when peaceful cooperation seems impossible or ineffective. They destroy their environments when short-term survival seems to require depleting long-term resources. They accept inequality when they believe it's necessary for prosperity. But different systems produce different behaviors. When cooperation becomes more profitable than competition, people naturally become collaborative. When everyone's prosperity depends on maintaining healthy relationships and environments, people naturally become stewards rather than exploiters. When individual security comes from contributing to collective welfare, people naturally become generous rather than hoarding. When meaningful work and social connection are available to everyone, people naturally become creative and caring rather than desperate and destructive. The tragedy of our contemporary moment is not that these alternative arrangements are impossible, but that we've forgotten they're possible. Somewhere along the way, we accepted the illusion that the problems generated by our current systems are inevitable features of reality rather than correctable results of specific choices. We've convinced ourselves that poverty, environmental crisis, social fragmentation, and meaningless work are natural laws rather than design flaws that could be fixed through the same kind of systematic experimentation that made Khaemwaset successful. But the villager's example calls us to remember who we really are and what we're really capable of. We are the descendants of people who created agriculture, language, music, mathematics, medicine, and countless other innovations that enhanced human life and possibilities. We are the inheritors of traditions of cooperation, creativity, and care that allowed our species not just to survive but to thrive in every environment on Earth. We carry within us the same capacity for intelligent collaboration that built Khaemwaset and countless other communities that successfully balanced individual fulfillment with collective prosperity. The question isn't whether we have the ability to create better societies. The historical record proves that we do. The question is whether we have the courage to acknowledge that our current arrangements are choices rather than inevitabilities, and the commitment to experiment with alternatives that might serve us better. This doesn't require revolutionary upheaval or the elimination of everything familiar. The villagers of Khaemwaset didn't achieve their success by rejecting all previous knowledge or starting completely from scratch. They built on the wisdom of earlier generations while adapting it to new circumstances and challenges. They preserved what worked from traditional approaches while innovating solutions to problems that existing systems couldn't address. We can do the same. We can begin where we are, with the communities and relationships we already have, experimenting with small changes that align our daily practices more closely with our deepest values. We can create circles of exchange within our neighborhoods that link individual prosperity to collective welfare. We can develop educational approaches that honor both individual potential and community needs. We can establish governance processes that bring expertise and democratic participation together in service of long-term flourishing. We can choose, in thousands of small decisions each day, to act as if we lived in the kind of world we want to create rather than simply reacting to the world we've inherited. We can treat our work as contribution to shared prosperity, rather than just personal advancement. We can approach our relationships as opportunities for mutual support rather than zero-sum competition. We can engage with our communities as experiments in creating conditions where everyone can thrive rather than just surviving within systems that serve only some people's interests. The villagers of Khaemwaset started with nothing more than the conviction that different choices could create different outcomes, the patience to experiment with alternatives to failed systems, and the commitment to measure success by whether everyone in their community could flourish, rather than whether a few could accumulate advantages at others' expense. They transformed a landscape of failure into a model of regenerative civilization that sustained prosperity for over 2 centuries, and influenced countless other communities long after their original settlement evolved into something new. Their gift to us is the knowledge that such transformation remains possible. Their legacy is the understanding that we don't have to accept systems that consistently produce outcomes we don't want. Their challenge is the invitation to remember who we are, what we're capable of, and what becomes possible when ordinary people commit themselves to creating extraordinary communities. Rest well, dear dreamer, knowing that the dawn brings new opportunities to choose differently, to experiment boldly, and to create the kinds of communities where everyone can flourish. May your dreams be filled with visions of possibility, your sleep be peaceful with the knowledge that better worlds are achievable, and your awakening be gentle with the understanding that the future is still ours to write. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.